What's up, Liron here, and today we're gonna paint this scene. What's up, Liron here. Thanks for joining me in another vid. Today we're gonna paint this scene, and I'll tell you what I want to focus on. So we've got that big building here in the corner. I want to paint that. Let me show you. There we go. This building in the corner. Then we've got this nice little tree here, and some cars, some people crossing the road. I wanted to focus on making it look like a lively street scene, I guess, and also capture the light in a nice way. So in any case, I don't know what's going to come out of it. Let's just get started with the process. It's a bit of a challenging one, so hopefully we can do a good job at that. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm starting with the drawing process, and I'm running this at double speed, but I promised myself that the painting process is going to be in real time, and so it will be. But I just wanted to go through this because there's a lot of basic guidelines and setup. It takes a long time, and I'm just afraid it'll be too boring. So I set up a basic line for the horizon, and on top of that, I put a vanishing point. Okay, I'm trying to assess, based on looking and observing the scene, where the vanishing point should be. Now, the vanishing point is where all perspective lines come converge to or come out of, depending on how you want to look at it. And every parallel line moves toward, all sets of parallel lines move towards their own respective vanishing points. So if you have several sets of parallel lines, they all move towards different vanishing points. I do have a few videos on perspective, and I hope to share some new ones. Now with maybe new insights and things like this, new teaching insights. I mean, I know the same things, but now I have better ways of explaining them. So all the lines are coming out of the vanishing point. I'm just trying to set up some basic lines that will help me draw the building, and I put the tree there for scale. It's a rather large tree, as you can see, and I put it there for just so that you're aware of the scale of the scene to some extent, and then I can place in the buildings and everything. Now I'm using all of these lines because they're going to help me to draw the zebra stripes for the crossing the road, and that part is important. I want to get that right because it's considerably in the foreground, and I don't want to mess that part up. And now, based on these lines of perspective, I'm placing in the actual lines. Now I'm adding more and more details. Now I'm going to put in some boulevard of buildings, I would say, to the left, coming out of the vanishing point as well, because this is all just one street vanishing into the vanishing point. There is a row of trees there. There are quite a few buildings with different characteristics, different colors, and so I want to capture all of that in. So what I basically have left here is to put in the buildings on the right and on the left, some cars on the road, and then the people. And there's tons of people walking their dogs. That's cute. I didn't get any pets in, unfortunately, but I always like to get pets, like a person walking the dog in a painting. It's a nice, I think, composition and arrangement to have like a large shape, that's the person, and then a smaller shape. So now I'm moving on to the building on the right, and this is where I'm going to devote most of my attention because it's such a large part of the scene. Now, when I'm looking at an object and trying to transfer it on paper, there are a lot of challenges, especially when you're working from real life. But the thing is, I think that's the most correct way to work from real life, because then using a photo, you can kind of visualize what it's like in real life and do it properly. But if you just work from photos, then when you want to do it from real life, it's very confusing. And it's funny how even when you're a master of drawing based on photos, it is still confusing. Trust me, I've been there, and I've been through the cycles of doing more outside, more inside. There's plenty of differences. So all of these challenges, to alleviate them, I simply try and measure and try and compare. And I have a few measuring techniques with the pencil, and this is a topic for a different video, but I may hold it up horizontally or vertically, and that helps me to assess the angles of lines. I may use the length of the pencil to measure, and there are techniques for that. You hold it out arm's length, and then you know that your measurement is accurate. And there's a lot of ways to do that, but the bottom line is you have to measure, you have to compare, and on top of that, you have to give your own personal touch of the scene, meaning you can't And a lot of people say, do I paint it as it is? Do I draw it exactly as it is? Do I give my own interpretation? And my approach to this is you have to give your own interpretation. And why is that? Because you can't possibly paint each and everything that's there. That's just impossible. So by definition, you're giving your own impression of the scene. Now, even if you work photorealistically, you still have to give your own impression or interpretation of the scene, because translating real life, or even a photo for that matter, to a painting, still you won't get everything 100% right. So there's always a bit of interpretation going on there, okay? That's important to understand. And so you're always simplifying things. Now the question becomes, to what degree? And for me, the degree really depends on my mood, to be quite honest. Sometimes I just feel like doing something that's easier for me, so I will take it a little easier, I will simplify more, abstract more. Sometimes I feel like I don't have the mental strength to do that, because it does require sometimes the other way around. So it may be easy or hard depending on your mood as well. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to just paint it as it is. I'm not going to put my own interpretation, because that's what gives me the trouble, you see? So it really depends on where you're at that particular point. My thing, and a lot of people get a little caught up in the concept of developing your own style and how should I, make it personal and make it my own. And my approach to this is very, very simple. Your style will develop no matter what you do. It's going to happen no matter what. And if you're just working consistently and you're creating each and every day, your style will be created naturally. You don't have to do anything to get it. And this is my feeling. And I started realizing this when people told me that they could, if they would see a lineup of paintings, they could know which one was mine. So I had my own style. And that I do have my own personal way of doing things, and they can tell that it's my way. And I couldn't tell. That's the artist curse, the part of it, at least. It's hard to be objective when it's your own art, and art isn't objective to begin with, so that's, you have a lot of trouble figuring out what's good, quote unquote, but you have to feed off of third party, I would say, feedback, other people, what they say, which is why I really encourage people to share their art, and at least if you don't want to share your art just because it's not you, then cool. But if you don't share it because you're afraid of what people will say or stuff like that, then I would wholeheartedly recommend you do that, because the feedback you get is really, really important. I think I can attribute most of my quick, and I will say it's quick, growth and improvement to sharing with other people my art and getting feedback and understanding what I should improve. And also by documenting and showing how I create it, I can go back and take a look and see, oh, I royally messed up this painting that back at the time I thought was really good. Okay, so there's just a lot of things going into making a good piece of art. And we can get into the whole, again, subjective, not subjective, what is good. But let's say technically and skillfully, it takes a lot of work. So my approach is just to do it, just to create a lot. I like to share it. You don't have to, but to create a lot. That's the main thing that will help you. And now I'm starting to mix some paint, so it takes me some time to get into it. But again, my thing is just practice as much as you can, on as many things as you can. Try to create in many different methods and ways and approaches. And with time, your style, your personal way of doing things will naturally, very naturally emerge out of that. Okay, now we're starting to put in the paint, and I'm starting with a fairly dark wash because I do want to create some contrast with the buildings, with the buildings themselves. They're going to be very sunlit. And so I want to make sure that I get that right. And if I start with too thin of a wash, I won't get the contrast I want. And what that'll lead to is me having to go back with another layer. Now, this painting process was quite some time ago. I believe it was maybe even 6 months ago, I think. And the thing with that is I have a much newer perspective on how to do things. Now, you see, I did allow the paint to bead, so I have a little more time to work with it. That's important. So I will say I improved since, hopefully, and also I have a different ways of doing things. However, I went back to looking at this one and I remembered it to be not as good of a painting. And then when I looked at it with the fresh perspective, I saw and recognized a lot of good qualities in it. The work method is a little dated in my personal development and style of art. But I will say that it has, I think, interesting composition. The values are mostly on point, so I'm pleased with it. Now, you see, when you have the bead, you can take your time with the wash and take it easy. But that's one of the hardest things, really, in watercolor in particular, getting that balance and realizing when the wash is dead and you can't work on it no more. And that's a major point of frustration. It was for me, at least, and I see a lot of people that the wash starts to dry on them. They get all these cauliflowers and blossoms, and you really have to work fast at times. Working fast comes at the expense of working organized, and so when you're just getting started, this fast-paced working really can overwhelm you. By the way, I forgot to put that tape there, that tissue there on the side, so that I actually can dry my brush. So now what I'm doing is, I fully dried my brush on the tissue, and I'm coming back with it like a sponge and soaking up the excess moist there. The fear is that this excess moist will bleed onto it back up top and will create these cauliflowers I just talked about. Now, I skipped this large white area in the middle, and that's where a tree is gonna be. I could have filled that in. It was just back then I was experimenting with different things. So my approach there was, if there's anything there physically, I'm just gonna skip that part and paint around it. I don't want to say it's the smartest way of doing this, but it's the way I used for this painting. Now, many times, and I do want to make this differentiation, if you have the basics down of art, meaning the composition aspect and drawing and even the values and the ability to view something naturally and figuring out what it looks like, if you have that ability, not knowing some techniques or being inexperienced with a medium isn't really a serious hump to go over, let's say. So let's say you have a lot of experience in oil painting and then you take on watercolor, then I think you got down most of the important things. So, and I want to equate it to this painting where the technique is a little off and it's a bit awkward. I'm negative painting, then coming back with paint, I'm filling it in weird patches that I wouldn't have done today in this way at all. But because I was lucky, I would say, with the composition, because I wasn't that good at it back at the time, and still I'm sometimes struggling with it. But because I got down the composition and the values are fairly on point, the rest kind of clicks together despite the awkward technique. You see what I mean? So the information you have inside your head can really save you from bad technique, which is why I believe that anyone can do it regardless of the motor skills. So even if you're not that good in, controlling the line, controlling the wash and drawing straight lines and all of that stuff, you can still pull it off. And what I mean by pull it off is create something that looks good and is pleasing to the eye for other people as well, if you have down the other things. So, and this really reminds me of the experiment I did of sketching with my left hand. It was, in my opinion, one of the best videos I have on YouTube. I hope it gains more traction in the future. This video really goes to show you what I did was I sketched the scene with my left hand. Now, I was surprised at how hard it was because I don't have the motor skills. However, because I have an overarching philosophy of how to paint or draw or sketch what I see, I was able to pull it off and create a very nice, in my opinion, result. Mainly because I knew what I was doing on a deeper level. So the minor wobbly lines and all of that stuff didn't really matter. And that's a really important point when you think about it, because a lot of people think that drawing is like, they say I could never do that and it's really hard for me and I don't have the, how do you say, the physical, what would you call it? Dexterity, I guess, to control, to create the way I want. And I say you don't need all of that. That helps and that is built with time. But you don't need all of that, and you can create beautifully without it. And again, here I stopped at the right wall of the canvas. I just stopped there awkwardly, and now I'm filling in the middle space, and it may bleed into one another and run into one another. It is okay because it's the first wash, but my point is that my technique was very awkward, and still it worked out. Now there's another thing I want to talk to you about, and that is the color selection. A lot of people ask me about what color I choose and how I approach choosing color, and they're fascinated by, how did you know to use that color? How did you know to use this color? The answer is it doesn't matter. That's really the answer. And I actually want to do an experiment. I think I'm going to, I think I'm going to do it. And it's really, it makes so much sense. So mainly I use blue for the sky and yellow and red for the buildings. I think I'm going to flip it and do an experiment where the sky is kind of yellow and red, and then I'm going to use for the buildings and for the structures blue. I'm going to try and flip the script completely, or either this, or I'll do something completely random in which I just paint using whatever color I pick up, like my portraits. The same way I do my portraits, I'm going to try and do a landscape or a cityscape. And I'm going to prove to you that the color itself doesn't matter as much. It's, again, more about the values and maybe a bit of temperature. The temperature thing does help, but my color selection is random, and more than that, I choose my 3 primaries in advance, and then I may spontaneously decide to add some other colors into the painting. So I usually decide on what blue, red, and yellow I'm going to use, and then I know I may use a bit of violet, a bit of maybe burnt sienna, maybe a bit of green to help me mix some greens more easily. And then I just go with that. I don't overthink it. I see a wall, I put in a bit of yellow. I see it gets a little warmer, I put a bit of red. The sky is blue. I don't make too big of a fuss around it. I see a tree, that may be yellow, and then I'll add a bit of blue into it so I get a green. So to cut a long story short, the color itself does not matter. What matters really is the values and the drawing. Have an accurate, solid drawing to begin with. And the good values, and you can simplify the values in many ways. You can make them much simpler and easier on the eye. You can merge shapes, and that actually helps, and that actually works really well. Merging different shapes and stuff like that, it works really well. So I will say that that's a good way to go about it. But other than that, don't get too caught up on the color itself. That's what I want to say. So now I have a nice kind of mix of blue, a bit of yellow, a bit of red. I like to show the purity of the paint as much as possible when I can. So if you look at the building on the right, there is a bit of pure yellow in there, strong pure yellow, then a bit of red that was put wet and wet onto the yellow. Now I'm going over the tree, and you start to get this impression of green because it's yellow touching blue. It's still not going to be as strong, but it is starting to build up, and I'm going to treat that as my first layer, even though I did it in parts. This is my first layer for all intents and purposes, as long as I have one layer of paint over most of the paper. Now, I did leave some highlights. I did notice that back then, and even now I tend to do this from time to time, is to blow up the highlights and kind of ruin their color. So that's something I want to work on doing better. There was a man walking shirtless there. That was interesting. So in any case, now I'm starting to work on the second wash. And now with the shading, I really starting to add the shadows. I'm really going all in on them, starting rather dark, but not too dark. Sorry, moved my chair. Not too dark though. It will lighten up a bit with more time, giving it more time to dry, especially outside. I find that paint just dries a little differently, a little faster, even if it's not in sunlight or in direct sunlight for that matter. So now this wash is very tricky. It always is. Because you try to, at least in my approach, I try to connect a lot of areas, keep it flowing, keep it natural looking, and still have some kind of a realistic impression of the light and shadow conditions that I see in front of me. Okay, now the light comes in this scene, generally speaking, from the right. So most of this building, the left side, it's all going to be very dark. The part where I started, the wall that I started working on, should have a darker value, but not as dark, because it's still halfway facing the sun, if that makes sense. Light comes from the right, so the part of the building, the corner of the building, not the corner, sorry, the wall of the building that's on the right is very shiny. The diagonal part is midway through, and then the left is dark, and I hope I'll get that in. I don't really remember how I approached it. Now, I was afraid that some of the paint is gonna dry on me, so I sprayed a little water here, as you can see. Hopefully you cut that. It leaves a bit of droplets inside the existing wash, but that's fine. It's barely noticeable, and sometimes it enhances the feeling of the texture of the whatever surface it is you're working on. So I actually like that. But now coming down, I have to figure out. So I basically gave it some more time with the sprayer. Now I have to figure out how I want to continue with the shapes. And this is really, again, you have to observe the scene very carefully to notice where the shapes are and how they're built. Now notice how I'm doing some negative painting around the pole of the traffic light, which is really important for me to leave that in. And I have to be very careful to paint around it. You can see I'm being a little careful. I should probably come from the other side. That'll make things easier, but back then I wasn't moving around enough. Also, I cut it somewhere there, so maybe I should lift that up. But in any case, now I also left another random pole shape in the background, just to leave it for possible detail later on. I don't know if I just thought maybe I'll give myself some leeway and help myself later on. Now notice how I'm connecting the shadow of the tree to the building, because it's all in the shadow. The shadows cast to the left, and everything on the left is inside the shadow, and you want to make sure that you connect those if possible. If you're like me and you like the looser, more connected approach, and I love that kind of thing, so I really want to make sure that I do that. Again, another spray of the spritzer. Just me worried that the wash is going to dry on me, so I give it a few more moments to stay wet, and I preserve my edges that way, because once you lose the edge dries, it gets a little harder, you get a broken shape, and then you have to move on. So now I'm leaving just another shape there, leaving some light to it, but I'll probably kill that highlight later on. And I want to layer that dark backdrop against some light elements, such as the person I'm currently at the moment negative painting around. There's going to be two other people next to the sidewalk. We have that traffic light. Notice how I poured in some very thick blue and also very pure under the awning or whatever that storefront sign is. And the reason I did that is just to have some variety. If you notice, the top part of the building is a little more yellowy. Then you move towards the left, it's a bit blue or green. Down below, next to the tree and the traffic light, it's a bit red, and now we're back to blue. Okay, so just keeping it a little interesting. Shadows aren't black. Shadows have a lot of variety in them and are very affected by the environment. So now I'm wrapping up the shadow to the left of the building. What I do have to do is pay close attention to the shapes of the people and anything else that I want to paint around and leave, untouched or unruined. So yeah, and then I'm gonna do this. My plan is to do this all the way to the bottom of the building, and then I'll stop. The street level is gonna be a little lighter. It will be just light casting on it, which will be fun. At least we have a break. That's important, to have a break once in a while, because sometimes you have to do a wash. And here I killed that additional highlight. You have to work so fast and worry about the edges. Here I know I have a clear edge. It finishes right there where the building wall meets the street. So that's a good way to break it. Now I'm just going around the shapes very carefully, trying to leave them seen. And you see there's a lot of freckles of light there in the specks of light, dust, whatever it is, under the building. Now my plan is to continue this wash slightly to the left, and because again the building casts a shadow to the left. And then connect it, if possible, with the cars and with all of the different elements. I speak a little strange today. I don't know why, so you'll have to forgive me. I don't know why. I forget words, and I don't know. So I'm connecting it to the shadow under the car. Now, granted, right now we have a light initial wash, in a super dark wash. I'm gonna find the midpoint, okay, the in between these that will help to connect the two, okay? Because you can decide to do a painting that's only light and dark, and that'll be a nice little gimmick. But if you want to get a really realistic impression, and again, all this talk about should I exaggerate the contrast, should I not, that will really depend on what you enjoy doing and how people react to your painting. I really believe that, and a lot of people say this, just paint for yourself, and I'm 100% for it. One of the greatest insights I had was when Alvaro Castanet said, be selfish and paint for yourself first, and then for others, and then the result will come. However, I do have a level of recognition that the audience really is what makes a painting great in many ways. And I will get probably some criticism for saying it, but how people react to your artwork is a good measuring stick. So, for example, if you post a painting and everyone loves it, then it means that there is something about it, even if you don't see it. I try to look at the reactions. I try to assume honesty. I assume that the people have no reason to lie or anything like that. Notice, by the way, I'm leaving still speckles of light there to create some interest on the road as well. But I'm going to maybe kill some of them off later on. But I assume honesty. I assume that when someone says they like my artwork, they're being genuine. And I really believe that. And so when someone gives me a compliment, I usually accept it. But also the other way around is true, and I think it is important to note that if you post something and everyone doesn't like it, like everyone, or you get a lot of comments or even nice constructive criticism, then there is something to think about. I don't say stop creating, not at all. I don't say, give up, nothing like that. But I like to be to use the audience's reaction as a constructive criticism or as a measuring stick, just to know how people react to my work. And I think it's really valuable information, and I urge you to make use of it if possible. So now I'm continuing with the actual street. Now I do want to darken that up just a tad bit. What's really going to be shiny here or light here is the sidewalk. The street, from what I can tell, it generally, in many instances, it's darker. So I sometimes try to get that impression. Now, I am taking a bit of a risk because the wash I'm using right now is wet, but not as wet. So I have to be careful. And also, it's a glaze on top of another layer. So I have to be careful not to lose its freshness and not to lose its... it being unified and even. Now I also have to work very carefully around the highlights of the zebra stripes, and I also have to work very carefully not to reawaken the sharp contrasty shadows that I painted earlier. Okay, so it's fine if you add a mid-value wash on top of a very dark paint. You just have to be careful. Okay, so don't worry too much about it. You see, I'm covering it up. I actually kind of negative paint around that shadow of the traffic sign, but I should probably cover it a little more because that way there won't be any funny gaps there, and it's okay to cover it up. Now, I left this weird highlight for the dog leash, just in case I'll use it later on. Don't worry about it too much, and this left edge can kind of paint itself. There's not an awful lot of things going on there. And now my challenge is to pull this painting together into something that's even, now that I have some very strong contrasts alongside very light washes. So I'm trying to find the mid-value. Now notice around the tree's trunk, it became a little lighter because I used a very wet wash, especially compared to under the storefront at the very front and right side of the painting. And that difference here is important because I'm going to have a very good mid-value there under the tree, and then I can bring out some stronger shadows there. Now, on the very contrast, we painted the side of the building that's very dark. Now we're going to paint the front side of some buildings that are going to be very light, but with some stark shadows for the windows and some details. Now, the walls that we're working on right now are directly hit by the sunlight, and that's important to remember, because they're going to be generally light. My challenge is how do I bring a very simple impression to them, making them look good, but keeping them simple and abstracted and real from afar. Okay, so I want the person who's looking at this painting to get a realistic impression on the left, a semi-realistic. An impression is an impression of the real scene. And the challenge is, how do I do that without going overboard with the details and stuff like that? And with that, we have the added challenge of the perspective. So I'm going to put things literally in perspective here, and I want to make sure and ensure that I follow and adhere to the perspective. I also have to take into consideration all of the trees here that I'm going to negative paint around. And yeah, so that's just slowly building it up. The cars on the road, they're missing something, a key ingredient, and that's the mid values again. And I'm going to talk to you about that soon, and you'll figure out how important it is, and you'll see this really in action. Now, this dark shaded area under the trees is an important point. Here's me trying just to abstract, but it's an important point of contrast with the car. You see the car on the left, you can clearly see its top side, which is really important. And also the head of the person that I'm going to get to in just a moment, that's also important. There were quite a lot of people stopping by and taking a look at what I'm doing at the time, and I really enjoy it. I like it, and I take it as part and parcel of painting outside, or as the entry, the cost of entry to painting outside. If you want to paint outside, you have to accept the fact that some people are going to stop by and ask some questions and maybe help you lose your concentration. Okay, so now I'm putting in, that's important. Now I'm putting in the mid values. So that's a wash that's fairly light. And you see notice how it pulls the car together and makes it look three-dimensional. It puts it into the scene successfully. And this is a part where I really like. Now there's the truck behind that car. And these are all, of course, the cars are moving constantly. So these are made up. I saw a car, I caught a glimpse of it. I drew the general outline. And then I just build it up based on what I saw back then. Now I'm trying to get the right balance of red because I wanted to melt into the back side of the car, I believe. And I don't want it to spread too much, but I don't want it to, you just have to find the right balance. And that only comes with practice. Now, one more thing, I'm going to zoom in a little later on so you can see some of the details. I know right now it's still pretty zoomed out. I will zoom back in it just a little bit so you can see some more details. But for now, I'm putting in the truck behind the car. Now, this is a little dark. I don't know why I went so dark. But in any case, this level of darkness is going to bring out the shape of the car that's more in the front. Okay, so that contrast always plays a role in creating shapes. And I always say this, by the way, you can see some of my mustache there on the right, top right corner, there it is. But I always, that's funny, but I always say that the way we see things is in values. So when something's dark or light, or there's a contrast, or there's a change in something, our brain interprets it as the actual subject we're looking at. So light and shadow is everything, really. The color is secondary. A lot of things, even edges are secondary. You can have messy edges or very tight edges, but if you get the values right, it's going to look really good. One more challenge I have in regards to, remember I told you the buildings on the left, I need to bring out the impression of the sunlit walls. I also have the building on the right that I need to take into consideration. By the way, this is a taxi, so I'm trying to put in a yellow sign there without having the dark paint bleed too much into it. So the building on the right, I also have a wall there that's highly exposed to sunlight. So there I really have to be careful and put in the details as gently as possible. Okay, use some dry brush to break the lines, make them not too prominent. It's easy to mess it up, at least for me, so I'm just sharing my own experience. Don't take it upon yourself to worry about it too much, but at least for me, I'm a bit worried about that, so I have to be extra careful there. Now, just a word or two about these streets. I believe this is, it's a street called Allenby or Halia. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of public transportation on this street, and I believe some lanes are exclusively for taxis and buses and stuff like that. So what you see here is a lot of taxis, basically. You see a lot of taxis there. One that's headed towards us, one that's headed away from us. So these are just a part of the life there in the scene, and hopefully if you know this place, then it really helps you figure out even better where it is and provide the sense of location. And there really is some special magic to painting outside. I think nothing quite beats painting in front of the reference and seeing it live. And I always, when I go back inside and I take paintings done outside, it always amazes me how good they look and how full of colors they are. And this is really important for me, just getting the color variation, and sometimes my work inside tends to be a little gray, and I figured it out after I did a session of painting outside, and I compared the two, and I was like, this is interesting. The painting that was done outside looks so much more alive, and then I started really applying more of that. Now I have to be really accurate, so I have to put my mustache and beard close to the painting. That's really important. But generally speaking, up until this point, I work very loosely and from a back. But then when the second wash hits, I usually have to be a little more calculated, measured, careful. But hopefully, we already have a good impression of the scene. Now, in terms of the process and the length of it, this woman now asks me, "Excuse me, do you know where is the blah blah blah?" I love it when people see you paint and they have the guts to interrupt. It's like, it's so impolite, but it's funny. And some people are the complete reverse. They're like they are so scared to interrupt you while you paint. It's so funny how that contrast plays out. And I'm like, yeah, no, sure, ask away. If you're talking about the painting, then feel free to. Every artist likes to be appreciated for their work. Now I'm using a lot of dry brush and moving against the natural direction of the brush just to get that scribbly impression, but being very careful to still go around the sign. In any case, if someone asks me about the painting, I enjoy it. I like it. It's funny how the people that don't ask about the painting are usually the most impolite ones. But in any case, that's funny. So now I'm putting in the green of the tree, connecting it to the wash from earlier. And you can see how, even though it was fragmented, it was done in two parts, it still looks good and feels good, especially considering the fact that I will darken some areas there in the shadow. And you have to remember, again, shadows aren't even at all, so usually you will get a lot of variation in the shadows, and it's important to be able to convey that in your art. Now I'm starting to put in some wet in wet for the shadows of the tree. Still some very strong highlights in it that I should probably get rid of, but in any case, it's funny how you always get the people asking directions in the background. I don't know if you look at the background, but it fascinates me because I already am very familiar with this painting and with this video as well. So I always look at it to see what other people are doing in the background. And yeah, I've been talking a lot recently about not being afraid of what other people think and painting outside, and I've been getting some really good feedback about that. A lot of people that mustered up the courage to do it, and I'm so, so happy for you. Whoever you are, really, a few people have said that. It brings me a lot of happiness. I think if there's something you want to do, and you should allow yourself to do such things. Now notice how beautifully that deep shadow of the tree creates this depth now together with the shadow in the background. I love that. There is a small highlight to the right of the tree trunk that I don't know if it's necessary, or I could just flatten it out, but now it's a bit too late, so I don't want to touch it. Now I just connected it to the street level, the tree, and now it feels like a good part of it. The one thing that's missing really are the figures on the one in the front and the ones on the side. So it's like you have a nice little scene, but it still misses some, I guess, areas of focus or areas of interest, and that will come in just a few moments. I love I like the way the traffic light sign contrasts with the dark red-blue background. I really think that's a good creation of I would say depth. I think, and especially with the tree now that's a little darker, I think there's a good balance there. By the way, I really wanted to do this again real time, so it's nothing here is sped up except for the drying process. The painting is all natural speed, so you can see me work at my natural pace. I think it's important because sometimes we get the illusion that we should work faster than we actually have to. Especially if you look at a lot of tutorials. So I just wanted to give you something more authentic, and I try to do that a lot to show processes that are real time. Sometimes due to time constraints, I can't because, for example, Saturday's vid, I had to pump it out real fast because Then I had a lot of things to do, and so I had to shorten the process from an hour or something like this to half an hour. But with this one, I really wanted to give it to you, the entire thing, and you can really get a sense of the speed at which I work, which is sometimes fast, because you do have to work fast, but not always. Now I'm blending in these trees to the background. Sometimes I don't know what to do with something, so I'll just blend it into the background and hope it disappears there. That's maybe a bit lack of planning on my side. This is actually something I learned how to do much, much better recently. Now I lost a bit of focus here. I hope it'll return in a moment. Yeah, there we go. I wonder why that happened. But in any case, so now the people, some details on the buildings on the left, the building on the back in the background, the traffic lights, and all of that. These are all things I should take care of. Now I felt like this scene misses a bit of yellow, like pure yellow. It's usually a paint that I don't use a lot purely, and so I wanted to put it in there, and I think it really enhances the color harmony, I would say. A word or two about the tools I'm using, because I'm always asked, and I should probably just put it on my... there's this website called Kit, I believe, so I'll just put it there at some point, but I'm using a silver black velvet brush, mostly only that for this entire painting, so I have the size 12 that I'm using right now, and the size 8 that's a little smaller, or maybe this is the size 8, I don't know, it's hard to tell from here. So I'm using that. I'm using I believe at that time it may have been Arch paper, 300 grams. I also love Saunders Waterford the most, as you may know if you've been following my tutorials. Now notice how, again, dry brush. I don't want this building to pop too much. So yeah, that's in terms of the paper. The paints I'm using, it's an interesting mix, I would say. I think it's Phthalo Blue, perhaps by St. Petersburg. Or either St. Petersburg or actually Schmink, it could be. I'm also using a bit of a quinacridone rose-ish red, so it's not really a cadmium or a warm red. It's more of it's more of a cool red. And the yellow, I believe that's Hansa Yellow Medium, or it is Schmincke's Turner's Yellow, which is very flowy and liquidy. You have to learn how to work with that. Again, I never recommend getting too caught up on materials. And by the way, here's the subtle balance of, again, putting in the details, but not having them too bold and too striking. So I'm all for having a good balance with the materials you use. Don't worry too much about using the best of the best in the beginning. The one thing I wouldn't skimp on is the paper. You have to use good paper if you want good results. If you're a prodigy or if you're really good, you'll get a good result with anything. For me personally, it's very hard to produce a decent result with a really cheap paper. Because what happens is usually the second wash will reactivate the first. The washes reactivate very easily, and that can be problematic. If you work exclusively wet and wet, you may be able to pull something off, but again, not to the level of detail that you want and not to the quality that you want. So I really recommend you get a good paper. The brush is also important, the paint also, everything is important. If you can get everything to be good quality, then go for it. But I really started with Van Gogh paints that cost me, it was like 50 shekels, which is maybe $12, I guess. This is the shadows inside the windows, but I removed some paint from the brush. There was too much paint there, as you can see, so I removed it to make it a little lighter and a little drier. So in any case, yeah, that's like $12 for the entire set. Came with a brush that I used a lot. So, you can start very cheap. I heard a really good tip from Steve Mitchell from the Mind of Watercolor. I actually interviewed him, so you may want to check that out. But he said that the point in which you want to upgrade your tools is when you see the difference. If you don't know what you'll get out of the better tools, don't bother with it too much. Now, if you've been doing it for a while now and you're still using the cheapest of the cheapest and you're like, why I have repeating mistakes and stuff like that, you just gotta have to find your balance. I know a lot of really good artists here in Israel, that use very cheap paints and they produce beautiful things. We do have a lot of very talented watercolor painters, so the ones who do, some of them use very cheap materials and it still ends up working because it's all about your skills and knowing how to use the materials. So now I'm putting in the bottom parts of the trees here, trying to abstract as much as possible. There are a few details in the background, putting in some kind of a resemblance of trees without worrying about it too much. I'm not that pleased with how the taxi at the front looks. I like the one in the background a little more, but I will accept it for what it is. It's just a part. It's just an element. As long as the composition isn't completely broken and the values somehow resemble the original, then you're good. I'm working on actually developing, again, I mentioned this earlier, working on my landscapes the same way I do with my portraits. Kind of putting in the right value on the first try, if possible, and not glazing too much. But it's still a challenge for me because with a portrait, it's a very limited scope. You're just working on a face. But when you're working on the landscapes, there are so many things, or cityscape, or seascape, or whatever scape it is, or winterscape, it doesn't matter. Any scape that you work on will require some more advanced skills when it comes to simplifying and merging elements together. So it's just more complex. And I still find it hard to just put in the value that I see and abstract it in my mind, but hopefully I will get better at it. I think it's just a matter of trying out more, and I'm actually really excited to have you along this journey because you can see my improvement. And then when once I'm really good, and then people will be like, oh, how did you get so good? And then I can show them all the 700 and 800 or 1,000 videos that came prior to that, showing average and below painting processes, or average and above. I think this process is, I would call it a success. I learned a lot from it, and I like the result. Some people will say it's amazing. Some people will say there's a lot to correct here, depending on where you are and your, I guess, taste. But I learned a lot from it, and I love it. I love the result here. So notice how careful I was with this entire wall to the right. You really can't be too bold there. Otherwise, it's just too strong of a thing, really. I did want to include some, diagonal lines there, just to have a bit of an impression of the sunlight. I think I was able to create the impression I wanted. There was a bit of wires going on there, or something like that. Just trying to put in as few details as necessary to get this wall to feel like a wall. There's this drain pipe to the side that I wanted to include, that I felt like it was an important little detail. I may have been wrong, I may have been right, I don't know. The key for me is I try not to judge myself too much while I'm working, so I'm keeping it very simple and just going for it. And I trust that the feedback that I may get later on will solve some issues for me if I'm unsure if I did a good job or not. And this actually is something that I want to talk about more. I'll probably do a post on it of don't judge yourself too much and don't overthink things, especially artistically. Be as focused as you need, but not an inch more than that. And then afterwards, see what the reaction is and how your own reaction to the painting is in a week or so. So don't worry about it too much while working, because while working you have to be all in on the process. Worry about it later on when you look at it a week later or something like this. Now I really have to get rid of the paint here because it's all in the shadow, so it's barely visible. So you saw me dabbing most of the paint onto the paper towel, getting in another window there. I'll get probably a bit of lines running across the building, representing of balcony, kind of a balcony or awning or a ledge or whatever details you see there. But whatever I do, I make sure to keep it very, very light and very gentle, because it's in the shadow. You don't want it to be too ballsy, let's say. So I'm putting in some lines here, some lines there. You have to take into consideration the perspective, make sure you're on top of it. And luckily for me, I do see some of the pencil lines. You see, I'm trying to judge how to do it from the vanishing point. You see, I'm doing what I call ghosting. I learned that somewhere else. I didn't make that term up, but you move first above the paper and test out the movement, and then you actually do it on paper. So it's like doing a test. One more thing I wanted to mention about the perspective. About the pencil lines. That I get asked a lot about that as well. If I just leave the pencil lines there, if I don't erase them. And my answer is very simple. I don't mind the pencil lines. I leave them there. I don't erase them almost ever. The one instance I may erase it is if I did something that didn't come to fruition with the paint. So let me explain. You see on the bottom left side there's some scribbles. That's actually deliberate. I'm gonna place some shadows there on the street. But if I end up not putting that shadow in, then I just have scribbles on an even wash. So I'll get rid of that pencil line. But if I don't, if I actually paint it, I'll leave everything there. I see the pencil actually as a part of the painting process. I see it really as something that's important for the process itself. So for the final result, I would say. So I see it as a complete part of the painting, and I don't worry about it too much. If you strive for a more puristic, I don't know what you'd call it, approach, you may want to, get rid of it if you want to keep it just watercolor. There are some artists who do beautiful work and it's just in watercolor, and they make sure that they only use paint. They do a few preliminary sketches and then the rest is just with pencil, with color and paint. But I'm not like that, so I don't mind that really. But if you're one of those, feel free to, just whatever works for you, really. That's the main point, I think. It's just finding a balance of what works for you, still, I guess, looks good, and, So now I added a bit of a stronger shadow next to the drain pipe, just to create some kind of a shape to it. Now there are a few antennas there next to the rooftop of the building that I want to get in. Just make sure I get them lightly in. A few details. Now we're really in the detail stage. So we have the details in the, on the buildings and the street, and the biggest probably detail, which is the people. And we'll get to that in not too long from now. Now we have about maybe 15 minutes to the end of the process. There are these poles on the foreground that are really important. Now, because I slowed things down a little bit, it may feel like a little slower. I hope it still captures your attention. So let me know if it doesn't. Now I'm putting in most of this is dark, the traffic sign or the traffic lights. So I am putting in that dark part. I just painted around it to leave enough room. And I do leave a spot open at the very top because I'm going to put some red paint there. That's going to actually be the light coming from the traffic light. And I'm going to darken the pole itself. That'll make it a little pop, probably. Just have to be really careful with the paint consistency. I should have probably mixed a bit of a lighter consistency. It's still a bit dark, too dark of a red in my opinion. But on the other hand, it's just one detail out of so many that I'm perfectly fine with it, just kind of being there and not being perfect. As long as, again, and this is a huge insight that I had, what makes a painting look good is the overall composition and the overall values and all of that. It's not the final details, and it's very easy to assume that it's the final details that do that, or that make it beautiful, when it's actually not. It's the thing that really makes it beautiful is usually the larger shapes. And here I think I have a nice variety of large and small shapes that I think works really well. So the end result is really to my liking. That's at least how I explain it. So the larger shapes are much more important. If you squint your eyes or take a few steps back from the monitor, you'll understand what I mean. It really does affect it significantly, the large shapes. If you're worried too much about the small details too soon, you'll miss the main part, which is the large elements. But again, now we have to devote some attention to the small details. Today I will do this a little differently. I'm using a silver black velvet brush, very dry, I would say, because I need a dark wash. But what I would have done today is use my Princeton synthetic, very springy brush to get those details in. I think it will work a little better. I really came to, now about, 4 or 5 years into watercolor painting, I really have a strong understanding of what works for me. So I know what brushes to use and when, and what looks good. And this is really, it just takes time, So the ones I came to really like are the silver black velvet ones that I showed you now, the Raphael brush, which I absolutely love, and I'm slowly learning how I can produce some very thin lines with it, or small details with it. The Princeton one, the blue Princeton brush that I have, and also the Leonard brush, the large one that I use for mainly the first washes, because the first washes sometimes you need to be really you need to have the large enough brush to cover everything up, and it has to have good water holding capabilities. So so now I'm getting to the real interesting part here with the people in the foreground. So you get this guy here with a striped shirt that I wanted to get in. That was a nice little touch, I think. When I work on the person on the left with the dog, I'll probably zoom in a little. But I think I got a really good impression of it. The legs, I'm trying to be very gentle. I don't want them to be too prominent. And a lot of the impressionistic artists I follow say that it adds movement, and it does. But for me, it's just a small detail that I don't want to pop too much. So putting it in very lightly, making sure I don't have too much water on the brush. I don't even remember. Oh, he has a suitcase, I think, and I'm drawing that suitcase now that he's holding. So that's not a dog at the front. I just remembered now it's another suitcase. There was a lot of people with this guy. It's not like a suitcase. It's more like a James Bond kind of suitcase. The guy on the front is just a normal airport kind of suitcase you'll see. So now I remembered. And then there's a couple next to the left, next to the traffic light. This guy, I think, was talking on the phone. It's funny, now I'm starting to remember the scene. And it's really funny how you see one figure here, but it's probably composed of like 5 or 6. Because every time a person walks by there, I'm trying to get a glimpse of what they look like and incorporate it into the figure. People move all the time, so it's very hard to capture them. It's very rare that you'll find a group of people or just one person sitting comfortably and you have a lot of time to paint them. It happens, if you sit at a cafe or something like this, it happens, but it's just more rare. So you have to take advantage of it when it happens. One more thing, notice how the shadows really anchor the figure to the ground, these poles to the ground. It's really important how the shadows work. And they really help to anchor things and make them look more believable, give them some depth, or maybe even place them within the context of the painting's depth. So again, and you're going to see this again and again. I'm going to put these two figures in. First, the color of the skin tone, some hands there. I was very simplistic with my approach to people here. A bit of an autopilot thing for me, and I'm trying to improve that and move out of it. But it's also very practical to reduce people to their very limited shapes composing them. And now onto the shirt. A really good effect to have is if you have a dark background, you want to create an interesting contrast. What I like to do is to have the person's shirt white or very light, and then you can get a very interesting shape on it, which I probably should have done with this person. Classic, there's someone behind him, you have a nice little border, dark border all around his shirt. I messed it up, but and that adds also a lot of variety, and I can't stress enough, Tim Wilmot's tutorials are really good for it, and he has one with two figures walking towards us at the very foreground, and one of them has a white shirt, and I think that's a perfect example of how to do that. So again, now putting in the legs, I think this guy has shorts, so now I'm going to switch back to my skin tone color to get his leg to look properly. Man, I'm going to take a huge break after narrating this video because I'm starting to get super hungry. I actually just did a drawing lesson outside to a new student. So, and then I came immediately and continued with narrating this. And so I need to have a bit of a break. So yeah, and now you see I'm putting in the shadow, and notice how it immediately ties the figure to the ground. This is true with cars, with trees, with anything. Once you get the right shadow in, it will look much more real, much more believable, much more beautiful, I think. And now when we have the people and the building at the background, and I really wish that the person to the left has a white shirt. Please tell me I left it white. It seems like I did. Yes, awesome, I did. I just didn't remember. So happy. So now at least we get one person with a white shirt. I think it was a woman on the left and the guy with the pink shirt on the right. Now notice again how beautiful it is with the dark backdrop. And your mind fills in the blanks. You have a dark backdrop, has nothing in it. It's a storefront, but you can see anything because I didn't put anything there. Just a very dark blue wash with some very minor details, and our brains are amazing and they are capable of completing it, which is one of the phenomenons that I like the most, actually. I think that's what attracts me to Impressionism, just the fact that I can reduce the details and then the person looking at the painting will enjoy completing the details on their own. And I'm actually, and here finally I zoom in, and you can see how the feeling of light really comes from that contrast of light and shadow, as you can see here, putting in the poles, and it really is significant. One thought I had that I really wondered about was why I am so attracted to Impressionism. What makes people be attracted to Impressionism? And I don't have an explanation for that, but it's very interesting because I just know it's what I should be doing. I'm looking at artists like, I really want to review Chien Chung Wei soon. He has, I think he's one of the best really in the world, like Zbukvic and Castanet. He is so good at what he does, and he leaves so many details out, but you get a very realistic and real sense of the location. And I really don't know what it is about Impressionism that grabs me so much, but it does. And I don't know if you're like me, and I know a lot of people are here. A lot of my viewers are. So if you're like that, and if you like the Impressionism, that kind that really makes it look real, but then again it's very scarce in details. I want to hear your 2 cents on why you love that. What you love about that, because I am curious. I'm trying to analyze myself here, and it's really hard. But maybe you have another insight. Just very curious as to that. There's this Chien Chung Wei guy is really talented. The way he uses paint, the colors, the color schemes and things of that nature, he does it really well. So now I'm putting in that finally the figure in the most foreground, I guess the most foreground element of this painting. And you'll get a good close-up look of how all of the colors are going to blend into one another, and you'll have some very interesting, I guess, effects created. And I'm not worried about colors mixing onto one another. I am actually not that pleased with this figure in particular. I think the ones in the background turned out a little better, but that's fine. That's life. So I'm using kind of a mix. When I get to the people stage, I usually just use whatever I have on the brush, so you get a very varied gray. So you can see here there's a lot of red when it's close to the head, but then down below it's a little more greenish blue. And now I'm gonna bring back some lighter wash, I guess, for the pants, and I have to put in his hands and the suitcase that didn't turn out exactly the way I wanted it to. Trying to dry brush the legs so that it looks natural. Kind of messed this one up, to be honest, but that's fine, that happens. I really don't judge myself too much. I think I figured it out recently. It's really one of my strengths that I don't judge myself too much or too harshly if I don't like the result or something like this. A lot of people say, oh, you say that the result isn't good, and it is good. And I'm like, I may say it, but my intent behind it is like, I want to improve. So I'm not too hard on myself mentally or psychologically, I guess. Just observing, and if there's anything to improve, then I'd be happy to improve it. So now I'm gonna add that thing. I think originally I planned for it to be a pet or something like this, but I ended up not doing it as a pet. So you have to react sometimes to your gut and just do whatever feels like it will enhance the scene. Now, the way I cropped the person, I don't like as much because it's kind of at the front, but you don't see a part of his suitcase, and it doesn't even look like a suitcase. So I don't know exactly. I should have probably just had a bit of better planning for this figure, or maybe put a figure that's a little farther away instead of this close. But hopefully I will tie it in using that strong shadow on the let's say on the street itself, on the road. And now I'm mixing that dark paint, I guess. I'm gonna use a bit of yellow and blue to create some green and some things like this. There was a strong shadow cast by the person's face, so I'm trying to get that effect in. Some eyes, the eye sockets, very, very loose, and this will hopefully give it some kind of a sense of realism, just realism, as much as you can say with this kind of a very interpretive work. So darkening up the shirt a bit, just adding some details here and there. I really should practice just people for a while, just painting people and seeing where that gets me, because I do think there's a lot of work to be done here in terms of my skills. So now I'm done probably with the person. Just a bit of the suitcase. Make it look more like a suitcase, please. It's still not as much as I wanted it to, but maybe a little better. And hopefully this person in the foreground creates some kind of a sense of depth for the cars in the background. Some of the highlights there feel redundant to me next to the taxi, especially the taxi that's moving away from us, the one farther back. And I could very easily get rid of them, but I don't think I did in this example. Some shadows on the people here. I would like to include some French ultramarine shadow on the guy on the right with the striped shirt, and hopefully I do that. Very light shadow, on the white. You don't want it to be too dark. I usually end up shading white with blue. That's a good color to represent shadows, or purple, but it really depends on the scene. So now I think I'm going to switch my brush here. This is pretty much done. There's about 2 minutes more to the process and we're done. Just that strong shadow in the foreground. And sometimes I found myself doing that out of maybe habit. So I'm trying to now limit my use of shadows like this in the foreground only if they're necessary, because they're not always necessary, So trying to really just improve the way I convey things and interpret them so that they are actually anchored in real life and what I actually see. Many times it's easy to make things up. So now you can see a bit of blue there. I'm going to probably pour in some yellow at some point and a bit of red. I like to do these kinds of shadows very colorful because it is an element that's in the very foreground, and I do want to keep it interesting, so I do tend to do that kind of thing with a bit of flair of creativity. It may be a little too dark now that I think about it, but overall that's fine. So putting in the shadow, now I'm going to add a bit of yellow there, so you can see we get a bit of green. It's a nice way of reflecting what you see in the trees, maybe, creating a more harmonious result. And once I'm done with this one, I'll zoom out a bit and give you a better look of the final piece. But very pleased overall. I think it was a good painting for that time, and I learned a lot from doing it. I just figured that some things here should be a little darker, especially with the car heading towards us. I don't really like the way it turned out as well. Again, I mentioned this before. I think there's a lot to improve in that kind of place, but that's fine. As long as I got one car to look right, I'm pleased, really. If I get one person to look right, I'm pleased. If I get one tree to look good, I'm happy. It doesn't take too much. And you're painting and you're enjoying yourself outside. I really am pumping myself up to want to paint outside right now. I think there was a bit of a detail there on the traffic pole and a bit of shadow that I'm going to add. Just small touches, and here is the final result. I hope you enjoyed this one, and now we can wrap it up. Okay, so friends, I'm done here. Let me show you the final result. I don't have my headphones, so hopefully you can hear me well. Here it is, the final result. Hopefully I cropped in some pics for you to see while I work, so that you didn't just see this awkward angle. Here's the reference once again. My focus was this building, this tree, some of the cars here, the traffic lights, people, crossing, riding around. Tried getting that feeling. Funny enough, the person that came out the best, I think, is this guy here on the right. These ones are decent, but the one at the front was a bit of a challenge. I didn't want it to be a gimmicky, just a figure of just dark blotch. I wanted to put in some details there. Hopefully I did a decent job at that. And this is it. Let's wrap up this vid. So this is it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I've been waiting for all the traffic to go so you can actually hear me. Don't forget to check out my beginner's drawing course in the description box below. Also my Instagram, Patreon, I'm gonna put links to everything. If you want me to cover a different topic or something in specific, let me know in a comment below, and I will talk to you again real soon.